Do you remember the US Festival in 1983? And are you a fan of Van Halen? If you answered yes to those questions, you're going to really enjoy this video. What I found is I found an article, a couple of articles actually, that tell about what happened after Van Halen performed and this big kind of crazy party they had there at the festival once they came off stage. I, for some reason, just never heard about this, and I found a couple of articles where they talk about it, and it's pretty fascinating. And as you recall, in 1983, the US Festival, this thing was sponsored by Steve Wozniak from Apple, and they had, on the second day, it was Heavy Metal Day, and they had Quiet Riot, who was just, they were, if not exploding at the time, getting ready to just become one of the biggest things around. Motley Crue, this is the first time a lot of us really got a view of who they were and what they were all about. And then they had Ozzy, he had the short hair, which became kind of a thing. And then Judas Priest was there. Triumph, who I loved, Triumph. And then the Scorpions. And then, of course, the night was ended with Van Halen. And I remember when I was that age and I bought a circus magazine. It might have been one of the first circus magazines I ever bought. And it was just all about the US Festival. And it just had all these articles about all these bands that I loved. I was very young at the time, but I was starting to really get into this kind of music and love all these different bands, and especially Van Halen. I loved Van Halen at the time. And so anyway, what I have these articles. I'm going to read these things to you. And if you've never heard about this before, like I hadn't for some reason, you're going to find this really interesting, what happened right after they played there at the event. So this first article, and this one holds a place in my heart because this is actually from a newspaper in St. George, Utah, which if you follow this channel, you may already realize this, but the studio that we filmed this show in, the AudioMover studio, is located in St. George, Utah, which is where the studio is. You could throw a rock. If you threw it hard enough, you could hit Arizona from here. Anyway, this was printed in a newspaper in St. George, Utah, and it's called the Daily Spectrum, May 31st, 1983. And it says, US Festival ends, group throws elaborate party. And then this is from Devore, California. Long after the last note of music had pounded through the air at the US Festival amphitheater, headliner Van Halen threw an elaborate party for 500 of their most intimate friends. In a fenced-off enclave of the Glen Helen Regional Park, an area designated an ecological preserve by San Bernardino authorities, plywood and astroturf were laid down as flooring for the bash that kicked off in the wee hours of Monday morning. Van Halen, who had closed the festival performance of heavy metal rock music hours before, is a group that has gained notoriety for pursuing hedonism. San Bernardino County Sheriff Floyd Tidwell said much of the trouble during the Sunday performance was triggered by Van Halen. Quote, "There are a couple of bands we don't need to have come back," Tidwell said, referring to Van Halen, whose singer David Lee Roth bragged that the band was known to attract a rowdy audience and that concertgoers should, quote, live up to a rowdy reputation. Quote, "There's a reason to excite a crowd like..." Oh, sorry, I misread that. "There's no reason to excite a crowd like that," the sheriff said. "Some people were hurt because of what he said." Peter Ellis, top festival organizer and confidant of the event's backer, Stephen Wozniak, expressed his disappointment with Van Halen's performance and attitude. Quote, "David Lee Roth had to be helped onto the stage because he was so drunk," Ellis said. The focus of the massive post-performance get-together was partying, and Roth was one of the hardiest of the celebrants. Quote, "When you play the game of life, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how well you lived," declared the wild-haired lead singer. One wall of the enclosure was lined with video games, and 8 refrigerators were hustled up to keep the chill on strawberries the size of the baseballs. Well, I think it's probably supposed to say the size of baseballs. Stereo speakers as large as those used in Dodger Stadium provided a big sound for a big crowd. The 130-person entourage accompanying Van Halen to the festival were transported in 22 limousines equipped with televisions and bars. Picking up the rear were 4 trailer trucks and a power station for the party enclosure. Festival organizers, who paid $1.5 million for the band's performance, also agreed to cater to Van Halen's dislike of the color brown by providing a staff member to remove the brown M&Ms from the candy dishes in the band members' dressing rooms. Now, by the way, this is kind of a legend thing where a lot of people talk about this fact that Van Halen used to require them when they'd show up to play a show that they'd have M&Ms, a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown M&Ms removed. And a lot of people have looked at this over the years as just kind of a excessive, rich guys thinking, having people bow to their every whim, right? That's how it was seen. But the reality of it is the reason they did that was whenever Van Halen would go play someplace, they would send a big contract of all the things that they needed from a tech standpoint to make sure that they could pull off their show correctly. And what they did buried inside that contract was they said, and we need to have a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown M&Ms removed. And the reason they did it was because it would, if they arrived at the venue and that was there, they knew that they had read the contract. And if it wasn't there, then the people hadn't done their job. And so anyway, that's why they did it. It was just kind of a sneaky little way of making sure that the people at the venue actually did what they were supposed to do in the contract. Because if they had not read the contract and not gone through it to show all the technical specs and all the things they needed, they obviously would have never seen that they were being required to provide the M&Ms. And that's how they knew when they showed up to a venue. Okay, anyway, just kind of an interesting side note. Invitations to the bash were in great demand. A functionary slapped red stickers onto the chests of the select few who were asked to partake in the festivities. Dana de Rosiers, a blonde in skin-tight slacks, said she gained admittance by renewing an acquaintance with the band's road manager, last seen 5 years ago in Detroit. She said that most bands wouldn't treat her as well. Quote, "But they have been real nice to us," she said. "Only Van Halen would have a party like this because they know how to party." Okay, that's the first article. The second one, and this one's a little shorter, is from the Waterloo Region Record from May 31st, 1983. This is just, again, right after the US Festival was in May of 83. So this is just not long after it happened. Okay. The title of this one, the headline, is Van Halen Living It Up at the US Bash. This is from the Los Angeles Times originally. Devore, California. It was the belly of the night, long after the last high-powered note had thundered through the US Festival amphitheater and the shimmering heat of the day had swirled away by the damp chill coming off the desert. Throngs of disheveled rock fans picked their way along the dark roads, careful to step over the revelers who had sagged into slumber or a stupor on the gravel shoulders. One or two paused to listen to a roadside minister who was half-heartedly extolling the virtues of chastity over a bullhorn. This is pretty interesting because I haven't seen this in a long time, but I remember going to concerts when I was a kid in the 80s. Every time you went to a rock concert out front, there was always some preacher standing there shouting at everybody, telling them not to go into the concert. That was just one of those things. And here, I'd kind of forgotten about that until I had read this article. But the fenced-off enclave of the Glen Helen Regional Park, an area designated an ecological preserve by the San Bernardino County authorities, the night was just coming alive for the rock group Van Halen and 500 or so close friends, many of whom were total strangers just a few hours before. Van Halen was the headlining group that closed the festival performance of heavy metal rock early Monday morning. The group has gained notoriety for pursuing hedonism, a reputation likely to be enhanced by the party that followed the performance. The enclosure, which encompassed about half an acre, was covered in plywood and astroturf for the event. 8 refrigerators had been pressed into service to hold the food. The strawberries were the size of baseballs. The tone of the early morning party was set by David Lee Roth, the lead singer for Van Halen, a man of cheery good humor whose hair looks like it had been styled by an electric fan. "When you play the game of life," Roth said, "it's not whether you win or lose, it's how well you lived." One wall of the enclosure was filled with video games, and the stereo employed gray metal speakers the size of those seen in a baseball stadium. Van Halen, which is also the surname of two members of the band, was unexpectedly enriched for the concert because of what is known as the most favored nation clause in its contract. Actually, and this is kind of interesting. In short, the US Festival organizers agreed to pay the group $1.5 million, and among other things, to provide a staff member to remove certain colored candies from plates of chocolates in their dressing rooms. Van Halen does not like the color brown for reasons not entirely clear. And here this goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago with the brown M&Ms. But they made $1.5 million playing that show. Steve Mandel, the band's harried publicist, explained that Van Halen had traveled to the festival site with an entourage of 130 people, including extra security men, a special effects group, and merchandising staff. "It's a major mobilization," Mandel said. Outside were 22 stretched limousines, each with bar and television, 4 trailer trucks, and a power station for the party enclosure. Being one of the tonier events at the US Festival this year, invitations were in great demand. For the select who were asked to join the revelry, a red sticker with glue on the back was slapped on chests by a functionary. Donna DeRosier, a blonde, this is the one from the other article. Apparently they wrote these articles from the same kind of content. A blonde in skin-tight trousers said that she had been able to gain admittance by renewing an acquaintance with the band's road manager last seen 5 years ago in Detroit. We already read that. Only Van Halen would have a party like this because they know how to party. Tina Baker and Christy Doyle of Los Angeles were cagey when asked how they were invited. "We know people," said Baker, a teenager whose braces belied her efforts to look old. "Heavy metal fans have their own social conventions, and at the party, the most common attire appeared to be made of spandex or black leather. In addition to the food, barrels of beer cans were scattered around the enclosure, bartenders served mixed drinks, and garden tables were set up with Kizano umbrellas." The band's members actually made only a momentary appearance at the party when they were carried through after their performance. With a bulky stagehand supporting them on either side, they climbed into their dressing rooms and closed their doors. Anyway, that's the end of that article. Anyway, I hope you find this stuff interesting. I'd never heard about this thing that happened at the end of the festival, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And if you hadn't, thought you'd find that interesting too, especially if you're a Van Halen fan. Sounds like them. And again, follow the channel, like the video, share your comments. If you ever saw Van Halen, I'd love to hear about it. And if you were at the US Festival, I would love to hear what it was like. I've seen videos of it. Of Van Halen's performance. I'd love to hear what it was like being there in the crowd while Van Halen played, or any of these groups, because I love all these different bands, but what it was like during that night when Van Halen took the stage, and what that event would have been like. Anyway, with that, as always, have yourself a fantastic day.